Okay.
Beautiful. Okay. Unan. My name is Nathan Mizell, third year legal studies major at UC Berkeley, UC in pronouns. I am the vice chair of Berkeley's Police Review Commission, a member on the Mayor's Working Group for Fair and Impartial Policing, and a former student employee at San Diego County District Attorney's Office. Um, Now, perhaps my most salient qualification for this is just having been a Black man in America through lived experience. Um, and I really got started in terms of the policing work. Well, I had worked in broader student advocacy before this, was in my senior year of high school, actually, where I was a member of on the school board, and there was a question, a student member on the school board, and there was a question about introducing drug sniffing dogs into schools to deal with what was perceived as an uptick in drug use among high school students in particular. Um,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was clear to see quickly that, you know, when the private contractor came to present and give the information about the program, they gave us no data about if really the actual effectiveness, false positive rates, general effects in terms of people who are end up being subject to some sort of search. No data at all. And I asked, can we get some data? None. Can we get some data? None. And ultimately, the board decided to approve it for the one. And it kind of showed that when it comes to safety, and this idea of safety, there are certain mechanisms that have been pre-existing that that there's very much a natural inclination to think that's the right thing to do, that's the right direction to go, that's how things work. When ultimately there are some underlying problems with that thinking, and that problem extends to all aspects of policing. So I'll jump right into it here. So the origins, I will be brief here, of policing, of at least modern policing, started in 1829 with this man here named Sir Robert Peel, who founded Metropolitan Police in London. And one of the main reasons for the founding of this force was to address emerging social conflict that dealt with rapid urbanization. You're coming to a point where you're entering really the Industrial Revolution. Economies are changing, jobs are changing, and you're getting closer to an era where workers working, obviously working in the factories, are are starting to have some discontent in terms of conditions, pay, and really the early origins of terms of unionization. And Mr. Peel kind of wanted the force to address that, at least in part. Um, Though one of his foundational quotes was, "The police are the public, and the public are the police." And one of those foundational questions to think about throughout this presentation is, who are the public, right? Who are the police protecting? Who are the police responsible to? Who are the public in terms of policing, and how that has evolved throughout American history. So some more quick background here. Police in America, before any modern police forces, there were slave patrols, which began in 1707. Um, these functioned under the Fugitive Slave Acts, which quickly, very early on in American history, attached this criminalization to Blackness, and served as, a way to really maintain, obviously, the status quo at the time of slavery um, through public funds. The first publicly funded police agencies in America were ones mostly focused on slave patrolling and returning enslaved persons who had escaped. Um, Moving forward into the 1800s, you enter what's often referred to as the patronage or political era. Don't need all these details, but essentially, the early eras of policing and modern policing was essentially you became a police officer if you had political connections. When the next mayor got elected, new police officers were assigned, and there was virtually no training for the job, and it wasn't even full-time job. So that is really the early eras of policing in America. So this here is a quote So originally there was background, but this here is a quote from August Vollmer, who was the first police chief of Berkeley Police Department and is considered the father of modern policing. Um, Essentially, I have this quote here to lay out the fact that he was saying this almost back in 1920, that the previous era, referring to the patronage era, had been this era of ignorance and brutality, and that it was a rotten foundation that could not stand in such a progressive era of the 1920s and in such a progressive country. And that fundamentally the public deserved and demanded better of the service. That may sound very eerily familiar to today, as many of those same thoughts that policing has a fundamental problem in terms of brutality, in terms of the logic of its functioning, are very much still with us today. There he goes. Okay, August Vollmer, for the Berkeley Perspective, important for you to know, the father of modern policing, first police chief, all sorts of firsts in policing were created by Mr. Vollmer in terms of a more scientific investigation, motorcycle patrol, radio communication, requiring college education, all sorts of things. But on the other hand, this quote here where he says, for years, ever since the Second War, I've studied military tactics and used them to good effect and run crooks. After all, we're conducting a war against the enemies of society, and we must never forget that. So you have these parallels where Mr. Vollmer, did introduce at the time very progressive reforms in terms of investigation, patrolling, college education. But you also had this underlining thought that, those who were being arrested, those who, were being, those who order was being maintained over by police were enemies and should be viewed as such. And that thought as well has carried forth into modern policing. So I'll give you one commission report again. I expect anyone to remember all of this. But very early on in policing, with the Wickersham Report in 1931, we knew very early that police were often very brutal, lawless. It was literally, the whole section was literally dedicated to lawlessness and law enforcement, and how often police brutality was, and how fundamentally policing has failed to enforce prohibition and to enforce the laws at the time that were thought to keep communities safer, either physically safer or just safe from the effects of alcohol. And essentially the commission's findings revealed that something fundamentally had to change about policing and how it functioned in America, and had to change about how effective it was at actually accomplishing its goal of maintaining safety. Unfortunately, most of the findings of the report were ignored, and this is a very common finding you'll find when reviewing, different commissions on law enforcement. Reports are made. Sometimes reports have very good suggested changes, and those changes are never really implemented. So the foundational question here is, who does the law apply to? Now, the commission as a whole, of course, was evaluating the entire, apparatus of policing in America, but when we view it in terms of who they were policing, going back to Mr. Vollmer's quote, the law applied to, at least the full extent of the law applied to a smaller group of Americans, and much of the law was not important depending on a variety of factors. Sorry. And we'll skip that one. Okay, so important slide here, the problem of police perception. Really, no matter whether you believe police are very important in society or whether we need to abolish the police, there is a fundamental problem of police perception in the United States, which is mostly founded on myths about policing. The first one, very important to understand, is the view that police are an unqualified good, that the existence of police in itself is a good thing, and that without police, safety would not be possible. Um, this view is simply false and simply doesn't consider that, whatever you consider policing to be, there are going to be foundational blocks that create the development and the deployment of policing in whatever form that may be. And certainly in America, it has not come in the form of being an unqualified good for society. Um, and that's very much just an objective review of reality. Um, a second big issue is viewing police issues as individual and not systemic. This is a very common view that you hear. That it's the bad apples. We have to get rid of the bad apples in police forces. Are very common. Is I've had a positive experience with police, and that may truly be said as a just a positive, not trying to be political comment. But the issue is, for one thing, as I believe you reviewed in the readings, was American society is very segregated. And in terms of our friend groups, it's even more segregated. So when one person says they've had good experiences with police, there are so many underlying factors into that statement. You have to consider, of course, the race of the person. You have to consider where they lived and grew up. You have to consider, what community structure they had. All of these are big factors, but oftentimes because good experiences are, obviously very popular to report on, are seen in the news, there's this perception that the bad police or the bad officer is a one person in the department who we just need to get rid of, and there's no foundational issue with policing. Third view, that's the issue, is the view that vague changes in police practice will fix policing. And vague language in policing often obscures the damage being caused. So here, first one is community policing. Now, community policing can be a positive thing, but it means different things to virtually anyone you ask. Whenever someone says community policing, ask them to define what that means to them and what shape that will take in a community, because it is very often used as a term simply to sound as if the police are making a foundational change, when really they're just more or less placating the community through, let's say with Berkeley, let's say there wasn't a commission, it was just an advisory board to police, which many cities have had and have, that has no power to do anything, but allows the police to say, look, there's an advisory board and we're meeting with community members, and that's community policing. And that often does not solve underlying problems. And last one I'll mention is the view that proactive policing, and here I give you the example of stop and frisk, leads to a decrease in crime and a better society. It's simply false, my friends, and I'll get into more details as to why on our next slide. Oh, excuse me. There we go. Okay. So let's take this one as a case study, broken windows and stop and frisk. So you may already be familiar with this idea, but broken windows was introduced by George Kelly and James Q. Wilson in 1982. And it's basically off this idea that to prevent crime, the best way to do it is to, address all sorts of crime, even very minor crimes, basically as quickly and at their source, because if not, it can perpetuate more crime if you don't address it. So this theory, which is likely the most famous in all of criminology, has been perpetuated and was utilized most notably in New York City. What they don't tell you about this theory is it was based on a completely distorted presentation of Philip Zimbardo's 1969 experiment. When Kelly and Wilson refer to the experiment, they basically draw a straight line from, sorry, let me back up. Sorry, let me explain the experiment slightly. So the experiment was, they placed a car in Palo Alto and they placed another car in the Bronx in 1969. And they let the car sit there and they were going to monitor what would happen to the car over the course of about a week. The car in the Bronx was vandalized within the week period. The car in Palo Alto was not. Um, and because of that, Kelly and Wilson inferred that if a car gets damaged, it would get damaged more. And in that communities that are considered to have more crime, this would be more likely, meaning you would need more police and more proactive policing. Here's what they didn't say in their very famous and often quoted article. Number one was that the first people to actually vandalize the car in New York were, quote, white, well-dressed folk. They were the first people to vandalize the car in New York. The car got vandalized more after, but those who initiated weren't even the people who would fit the example of Kelling's and Wilson's study. Now, number two, which is more damning, is after the Palo Alto car stakeout, so a week went by, the car was totally fine in Palo Alto. Zimbardo then moved the car closer to Stanford University, where he recruited a few graduate students to purposely vandalize the car to see if others would join in. Well, during that experiment, the graduate students actually vandalized the car even more than the experiment intended. Essentially, after beating a sledgehammer and starting hitting the car, they hit it over and over and over again. It was damaged greatly, and the very people they were supposed to be watching to see if they would damage the car became spectators and joined in as the car was being damaged by the graduate students. So what actually was shown in the study was that whether it's in New York City or at Stanford, people will join in and vandalizing things. And what he was really studying was how does anonymity and societal, equity issues affect one's potential to participate in such actions. And in both cases, whether you're a Stanford student or someone walking in the streets of New York, your car could be vandalized and people would join in both cases. Kelling and Wilson did not mention that in their article. They only mentioned the example of the car being vandalized in the Bronx and not being vandalized in Palo Alto. Okay, moving on. Berkeley Police Review Commission. And please tell me if I'm going way over time. I can move on, because I'd rather have all your questions, honestly. Was founded in 1973, came about after efforts of community members to create some greater oversight of police. Was actually supported initially in 1971 by the Black Panthers as well, to form, some new form of accountability for policing. At one point, there was a proposal to break up the police departments into different neighborhoods of Berkeley. And that is very much rooted in the redlining and the difference in zoning that we see in Berkeley. Unfortunately, over time, while the commission's founding was a big step, it has been weakened through different litigation, and a mistake was made in terms of implementing the Charter Amendment back in 1973, because it wasn't a Charter Amendment, and that led to big issues. Anyways, voters fortunately voted in November to pass Measure 2, which will fix that. Thank you, Berkeley voters. That is an important step. Okay, here's BPD in recent years. I'll skip past this, but the gist is often BPD loves to say that, okay, we're Berkeley and we're the best trained, and things are great, and we got, quote, state-of-the-art training. And these are all things that have happened in the past year, or not in the past couple of years. And in the case of this 2020 officers in the moving car, they were removed from the force. But again, state-of-the-art training, shooting at moving cars for what amounts to jostling a shopping cart and taking some paper towels out of I forget what store it was. I think it was like CVS. Yeah, not the best training. Moving on. So now we're moving kind of into like what are solutions? Like how do we address some of the things? So one thing is the Mayor's Group on Fair and Impartial Policing. This was created in response to the Center of Policing Equities report in terms of racial disparities in stops and searches and the differences in yield rates. Whenever you hear yield rates in reference to criminology, it's dealing with essentially if a stop is conducted, what is the yield of that stop, right? So if the stop is conducted and let's say a weapon is found and the person is arrested, okay, well that's going to be a hit. So that's going to be something that puts the yield rate higher. Or if the stop is conducted and nothing is found, that will lower the yield rate. In Berkeley, there is a large discrepancy between the yield rates of white persons and black persons. Black persons are half as likely to yield anything during the stop compared to white persons. Yet they're stopped 20 times, or 20 times more likely to be stopped than the white person in Berkeley. So these are very big issues, and Berkeley has a big disparity problem, and this working group has been working on it. Our findings are almost complete and should be going to council soon, but this was an important step. And then in terms of really reimagining how we see public safety, we have BPD, which is a proposal to create a first in the nation Department of Transportation that will take over traffic enforcement function from police. And these would of course be unarmed employees. And also of course having technicians to really focus on pedestrian safety and transit equity and how critical design can be into actually fostering safety. It's not something we really have evaluated well in American cities previously, but we hope BPD can be really an all-stop shop for addressing all of those issues. And that's very much in the early stages of planning and then hopefully implementation in a year or two here. And then what can you do? And hopefully we can discuss with more questions here, is first just ask questions. Please ask questions. I think, comfortability with what we know or what we think we know is one of the easiest ways to continue to propagate broken systems. And this is not a purposeful action on anyone's part. It's just obviously when you're born into things being a certain way and your life functions with things being a certain way, and if the issue doesn't affect you directly, it's easy to believe that that's just the way things work. So ask questions, be critical of systems. Seek knowledge inside and outside the academy, hugely important. I've read, I don't know how many studies and books and all sorts of things that deal with police, criminology, racial equity in general, but it's also important to actually understand what is happening on the ground, whether in your community. Having those conversations with locals, having those conversations with people who are familiar with the very topics, I'm talking about. It's really critical to having a full understanding. And that's actually why I put this slide here on the right, which is, a slide of what interventions do incarcerated individuals think would have made a difference in their lives. And they're all pretty, I think they're all things we all agree that are positive things that we should be doing. Mental health counseling, affordable housing, a path to go to college, a livable working wage, all very practical things. And the biggest thing is 0%. None of them thought that nothing would have made a difference in their lives. And I think it's critical to look at something like this and understand that, right now our main intervention when we're encountering, something we consider crime is of course the police. Now, I fully agree that if there is a immediate situation of potential harm towards a person, there should be some type of action. But often many of these issues have been left sitting for years, decades, America's case, centuries, unaddressed. And then instead of addressing the issue, we use essentially our responsive force as police to kind of just mitigate the issue and not actually look at the foundational problems which have created the really mass incarceration and police functions that we see in America today. And yeah, that's the presentation. Please, questions on anything in it, anything outside of it. And yeah. And I know that was a lot of information, so please feel free to ask any questions, and I'm happy to share this and anything accompanying it after as well.
Well, one thing I wanted to say, because since the pandemic, I've also been attending the PRC meetings. And I can say from, as a league member and sitting as an observer in those meetings, I've been really impressed, I have to say, Nathan, with how you, in those meetings, hold the law enforcement representatives accountable in the actual meeting. Those meetings often, sometimes they feel tense. And I've noticed that you kind of continue to press on to get like real responses to questions you're posing. And so I just wanted to, thank you for having the courage to do that, because it can be intimidating to try to hold a police chief accountable in general.
Thank you, Candy. I really appreciate it. But yeah, for me, I think in my work, it's critical. In terms of time, I sacrifice a lot of my time doing work. And, when I ask myself why I do it, it's because, functionally there are issues that have to be addressed with policing. And we can also, acknowledge the positive things, which we often do in terms of our commendations and such. But when there are structural systematic problems, as we see in Berkeley, the answer can't just be, well, we're Berkeley and we're not Oakland and we're not XYZ department and we do things well. Well, I mean, the data shows that there are significant problems. So we should talk about those things.
I'm curious what you think can be done to help educate or inform the public about the different issues that you see. I think like there are a good number of folks who still don't really understand, why do we have this police review commission? What do they do? And like, why is that work necessary? And I'm not saying I believe those things at all. I totally disagree with that, but I'm just curious, what you think can be done. Because one of the limitations I've seen with commissions is that just generally they're limited in what they can do, not just having, in your case, having power over police, but just in terms of connecting with the community, even it can be limiting.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So we had, I think initially with the commission, certainly in some aspects it is limiting in our ability to connect with the public. We had earlier tried to create an outreach subcommittee, but we had been bogged down with so much work in the past year, we haven't yet gotten to it. But I think what is critical to just wider public knowledge is, first of all, these issues being a question in people's mind. Now, in the Bay Area, it may be a question in more people's mind than on average, but even a question that is there something systemically wrong with policing is foreign to many people. Now, they might have become more aware following George Floyd and such, but first building block is we have to get people past the idea that it's just one officer and one little thing, and that is actually a problem of systems where we see, for instance, disparities in stops and searches in 98% of agencies in America, and obviously in disparate numbers in shootings and all sorts of things throughout the country. And these are systemic problems. So I think when I think what I try to do, honestly, is when I have different classes, if the subject matter is connected at all, I ask professor, can I just reference this? Can I just inform people this body exists? Because knowledge of even its existence is limited. And I do think we need a different method outside of just the commission or the new board to reach people. And some of the recommendations in the Mayor's Working Group report will try to address that. We're looking into hopefully getting a contract like Rahim, for instance, which I've had in Oakland, which is a service to essentially de-links just police complaint reporting from us and puts it into a broader, private company that can, hastily get reports online and hastily reach out to people. And, it's done a lot in Oakland so far. We're hoping once we bring it to Berkeley, report will be as easy as this happens, shows up on your phone, a couple questions, done. And I think that will hopefully, obviously the hope is not to have more complaints, but I also know that we have so few complaints to the PRC that it doesn't seem to add up to the lived experiences of the people I talk to. And I think that's functionally because so few people even know the PRC exists. And then because of how tough it is, frankly, to, maintain even a finding of, discourtesy against a police officer, people are just turned off to the process. And in that part, I think we need larger reforms.
Thank you.
Hmm.
You gotta hear from the interns.
Are there any questions coming from the interns?
I have one, actually. I had no idea that the father of modern policing was a police chief in Berkeley. And it seems to me that a lot of his ideas about policing that were in that quote you shared, observing military tactics to use in policing and identifying people as like the enemies of society. It seems like a lot of that has stuck around, but in your own opinion, do you still see that in the Berkeley police?
I mean, see, try to get me in trouble. No, good question. Well, I think in terms of what the data shows in disparities, from just a factual basis, there is a problem in terms of how Berkeley Police Department operates in its stops and searches of Black persons in Berkeley. The data is clear on that. And, I think that's why when we look at these foundational building blocks to how we got to modern policing today, here, I'll give you a different example. So in one of the videos, if I find it, I'll send it, from like sometime 1920s. It has like August Vollmer and the whole department, and it's almost like a propaganda video of policing, and they're like, oh, they saved the day. And back then there was a differentiation between being white and being Italian, or being white and being Irish, right? And those differentiations mattered then, right? The criminal assailant in this video was an Italian. And a white officer was arresting them and everyone was happy. Anyways, that change in time we've seen in the past, from 1920s to about 1950s, you see a change where those categories really become one. You're Italian, you're not just white. You're Irish, you're not just white. But Blackness did not get folded into those categories, obviously. Blackness stayed very distinct. And that change, or that lack of change, remains foundational today. Now, of course, every department has a non-discrimination policy, and they say, we don't discriminate, we don't discriminate, we don't discriminate. No racial profiling ever. Every police department on earth says these things. But when you look at the data and their actual function, it doesn't add up.
Thank you.
Where do we find these problems that are in the Berkeley Police Department? I mean, are they publicized? Where's the connection with the public about where the Berkeley police are not doing exactly the right thing?
Yeah, so great question. So in terms of, everything, in terms of just the incidents here, I believe everything you could probably find in like a Berkeley side article. But in terms of the data, in terms of the stop and search disparities, And the larger issues we've seen, those should be coming out in the mayor's working group's report. I don't want to give you exact date, but hopefully by the end of January, that should all be public.
What report? What report?
So it'll be the mayor's working group on fair and impartial policing. There will be a whole report and a packet of recommendations that will be getting released. Well, whenever council decides to approve it, by the date I've been told is sometime in late January. And that should kind of shed a light on, at least in recent years, how we've got into this process and what problems have stemmed from BPD. Yeah, I think that would probably be the most comprehensive document that will tie in a bit of all these things.
And then I just want to say, because I know we're beginning to run out of time, if there are, Matthias or Rohini, if you have a question right now, maybe pose it. And if you don't have a question that comes to mind right now, I'm sure Nathan would be open to receiving an email, of a question. See, they'll answer your email. So it's okay if you don't have questions at this time. We can continue the conversation.
I have a question.
Okay, great.
So you mentioned the new accountability board. But I was wondering what you think. Do you think it's gonna what kind of difference do you think it'll make between changing to an accountability board instead of the review? Do you think it'll have an impact?
I think it will have an impact. Do I think the board is fundamentally going to change, the systemic problems we see in policing? No. But in terms of the ability of first one to report, in terms of the timelines, which right now is 90 days and is unheard of anywhere else in the US, that has changed. I think another big factor, probably the biggest one to me, is access to records. Now, of course, legally, I can submit a public records request, and within 10 days, I'm supposed to receive at least a response telling me, here are the records, or we don't have the records quite yet, or can you, be more specific so we can, find the records. BPD, I can tell you, is notorious for being late and delaying and saying, oh, this document has this and this information, we can't release it. And there has been data that has been reviewed in the CPE report that I believe we still have not received publicly, despite the fact that that data is obviously something that should be public. After this charter amendment, we no longer need to negotiate with the department for years and years and years for data. We can simply, as a body, say, we need this document. You need to hand over this document. If you're not going to hand it over, you better have a really damn good reason, because it's now very clear with the charter amendment that access to records cannot be impeded or delayed until whenever they feel like it. And I think being able to get records quickly and being able to point out the problems when they happen would really be helpful, because one of the things the department does is they'll say, don't judge us for the department we used to be, judge us for the department we are today. And then we're like, well, we can't even get the data from the department you were 8 years ago. And you only want us to talk about the data from today, which is not that great, but there's a new data reporting going into place. We need the full picture to really analyze how the department is functioning. I don't think, either as, a PRC member or as a police officer, I'd want anyone to pull one single year of a data set and say, that defines BPD, So in those respects, I think it will make a big difference. And then number 3 is in terms of our ability to, impose a recommendation or find, that an officer was dishonesty or some incident of police brutality. The standard of proof has been lowered from clear and convincing to preponderance of evidence, and that is very significant in the sense that clear and convincing is a very high standard. It is, in many of these cases, it is impossible to reach that standard, not because the person isn't truthful, not because the incident didn't happen, it's just because that requires a certain level of evidence one can't produce on an incident when they were stopped by police, unless, you know, there's a whole video and someone was writing down what had happened and there were 3 witnesses. It's very difficult to meet that standard. But at preponderance of evidence, that's a standard that a lot more of these complaints, I think, could potentially be met because the standard is lower. Now, that may not stop an administrative law judge because the officers get an automatic appeal of our findings from throwing out what we find, but it will at least make it easier to hold police accountable, and, you know, potentially a deterrent, because now it won't just be, okay, I'm going to go to the Board of Inquiry and know I'm going to come out of it with no, you know, nothing sustained because the standard's too high. So those 3 factors will be helpful, though not, you know, immediately transformative.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so.
I thought of one more, but this might have to get put over as far as answering time is.
Okay.
My recollection of reading that measure that got passed was that there was going to be community involvement with the police. How is this community involvement? Is it starting, or what are the police looking at doing to involve the community and actually communicate, which means talking on an even level?
Are you thinking of the broader reimagining process and that public process that will be happening soon, or was
that
it?
Could be.
Yeah, because with the charter amendment itself, I don't believe there's any specific provision in terms of community engagement with the process. But in terms of the omnibus measure that was passed back in the summer, yes, that will be starting quite soon, actually. I believe, yeah, I know it was in December, Council passed this item essentially working to create a task force to first start the process, which has quite a few community members in it to begin with. And then after the task force has kind of grounded the first initial goals and first initial, like, you know, what is the mission we're trying to build here, there'll be greater community participation. I'd imagine like the T1 project, where, you know, we go to, you know, District 1, District 2, District 3, and have those meetings. Hopefully that can be, you know, post-COVID, so we get more engagement. But that should all be in the works, and the task force should be up and running by the end of January.
Okay,
Matthias has a question too.
Yeah, Matthias, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned, I think, in your presentation that the review commission sort of looks at complaints, and from those complaints identifies maybe systemic issues within BPD. And I was wondering, like, what form do the solutions that you guys identify for those issues, what form do those take? Like, do you make recommendations that, for example, BPD discontinues certain practices, or is it sort of recommendations of, like, for example, like telling them to halt the practice of traffic stops or that kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, there are 2 forms of complaints one can submit. There's the very much individual complaint, which is, you know, refers to a specific incident of some sort of harm committed by a BPD officer. And then those we end up going to a board of inquiry and then having findings, and that's all in closed session. So we can't use those, you know, specific incidents as, you know, a building block for greater changes in the department. But with the second form of complaint, which is a policy complaint, which does not put binding, you know, discipline on an officer, but allows us to review how a policy of BPD of either wasn't enforced or in its enforcement created a problem, right? So, we've, received one of those complaints recently, and we'll be, exploring how can we, I think it was in the, what was it, I think it was in, sorry, too much on my mind. I think, forgetting what area it was in, but we'll be exploring that soon, once the commission gets up and running. And then I think the third prong, which is out of the PRC's, immediate purview, is, the mayor's working group, which has been formed, which isn't based so much off of, the PRC work or a particular officer discipline, but was based off of the CPE report, was based off of the PRC's report in terms of disparities, was based on the NAACP and BSU's report on disparities, and the various council referrals that have already existed to address these issues, but were not fulfilled by the city manager. So, and that side of things, the PRC is not much help, but its groundwork in terms of reviewing disparities helps, make the impetus to create the working group to address it in greater detail. Because the Brown Act is definitely limiting, and that's one thing I like about the working group, because I can just email, to people and be like, hey, you want to work on this issue? Where with the commission, I cannot do that, unfortunately.
Thanks.
I think that Candia is going to switch over to me as host, and then we're going to do some breakout rooms for like 10 minutes. But Candia, did you want to say something else before?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna make you host, Adina. I just wanted to again thank you, Nathan, for joining us. We were able to have Roger Robinson join us, I don't know, maybe it was a couple months ago now. And I think we'd love to have both of you guys come back to kind of give us an update on your work so we can begin to track the progress and make sure we're educated as a league. So thank you very much for making the time.
Of course. Thank you again for having me. And as I said earlier, please share my email with everyone. Feel free to email and ask me any questions. And Candia, I think I'll email you the slides and a couple just additional articles that connect to what I presented.
That would be terrific. That would be terrific. Okay.
Right, yeah. Thank you for having me.
Stay safe. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thanks for coming. Good luck with the next semester.
Oh, I appreciate it. I think I got two operative legal studies classes, but excited. All right. Thank you, everyone.